When the smoke cleared over the field, the soldiers of the Empire of Brazil walked forward to see who they had been fighting all morning. And they stopped, because the enemy lying in the grass were not soldiers at all. They were children, boys, some of them 9, 10, 12 years old, and a few of them had tied on false beards, little beards of horsehair and painted wool, so that from a distance they might look like grown men holding a line. That is how the war ended, more or less. Not with two great armies, but with a country so completely emptied of its men that it sent its boys out in costumes to die. Now hold that picture in your mind, because it is the last page of the story, and it is a terrible one. What I want to know, what I have always wanted to know, is how any nation on earth arrives at a morning like that. How do you get from a proud, ambitious little country, one of the most modern in all of South America, to a field of children in false beards? This is the deadliest war in the history of the Americas. Deadlier, by proportion, than anything the United States ever fought, deadlier than any war this continent has ever seen. And I would bet almost anything that no one ever taught it to you. My name is Joaquim. For nearly 40 years I stood in front of a blackboard in Brazil and tried to teach children the history of their own country. And there was always one war I saved for last, because it is the one that changed everything and the one nobody wants to look at directly. So do me a favor. Put down whatever is in your hand. Pull up a chair. Let me tell you about the War of the Triple Alliance, the war that killed a nation and quietly killed an empire too, though the empire didn't feel it happen. To understand it, you have to stand with me in South America in the year 1864 and forget everything the map looks like today. Down at the bottom of the continent, around a great muddy river system called the Rio de la Plata, 4 countries were pressed up against one another like animals in too small a pen. There was Brazil, my Brazil, enormous, still an empire in those days, ruled by a bookish, bearded young emperor named Dom Pedro II. There was Argentina, proud and quarrelsome, still stitching itself together out of rival provinces. There was Uruguay, small and unlucky, wedged between the two giants and forever being pulled apart by them. And then there was Paraguay. And here is the first thing they never tell you, the thing that makes the whole tragedy make sense. Paraguay was not some poor, backward little place. Paraguay in 1864 was, in some ways, the most impressive country on the continent. It was landlocked, no coastline, no port of its own, hemmed in by its neighbors, and precisely because of that, it had spent decades learning to need no one. It built one of the first railways in all of South America. It had a telegraph. It had a great iron foundry, forges, shipyards on the river. It had almost no foreign debt, which in that century made it a very strange animal indeed. And it had an army, a real, standing, disciplined army, larger than anything its neighbors kept in peacetime. A small country, but a coiled one. A country with muscles. And how did a little landlocked country become so unusually self-reliant? For decades, it had been sealed off almost completely from the outside world by an iron-willed founder, and then run as a kind of family business by the López line. The state owned much of the land, ran the industries, controlled the trade. Say what you like about that, and there is plenty to say, but it had made Paraguay into something the region had never seen, a small nation that fed itself, armed itself, and answered to no one. That is the country Solano López believed he could turn into a great power. He was not starting from nothing. He was starting from a loaded gun, and that country had just come into the hands of a young man in a hurry. His name was Francisco Solano López. He had inherited power from his father the way a prince inherits a kingdom. Paraguay called itself a republic, but the López family ran it like a private estate. Solano was clever, proud, and enormously ambitious. As a younger man, he had traveled to Europe, and he had come home dazzled. He had seen the courts, the uniforms, the armies of the great powers. He admired Napoleon. Some say he wished to be a kind of Napoleon of South America. He brought back with him a bright, sharp Irish woman named Eliza Lynch, who would become the most powerful woman in the country and never let anyone forget it. He wore uniforms he designed himself. He began a grand new theater and a palace in his capital. He surrounded himself with the trappings of an emperor in a country of small farms and riverside towns, and none of that by itself would have mattered. Plenty of rulers are vain, except that this particular vanity was sitting on top of that loaded gun of an army, in a corner of the world where three larger neighbors were watching one another with narrowed eyes. So here is your powder keg. A strong, armed, isolated nation. A young ruler who dreams of greatness and cannot bear to be treated as small. And all around him, giant neighbors who treat his country as a piece on a board. Solano López had convinced himself of one idea, and it was not entirely wrong, that Brazil and Argentina, if they were ever allowed to, would carve up the little countries between them and swallow the pieces. He decided Paraguay would be the counterweight, the balance, the one who said no. The match was struck, as these things so often are, in the smallest of the four countries, Uruguay. Uruguay was tearing itself apart in one of its endless civil wars, two factions at each other's throats, and each of the big neighbors had a favorite. Brazil backed one side, Solano López backed the other, and he sent Brazil a warning: stay out of Uruguay or there will be consequences. Brazil, being an empire and being large and being quite sure of itself, did not take the warning seriously. In late 1864, Brazilian troops crossed into Uruguay to settle the fight in favor of their friends, and Solano López did the thing that no one expected a small country to do. He did not back down. He acted. There was a Brazilian steamship called the Marquis of Olinda making its way up the river, carrying a provincial governor and mail and cargo. Paraguayan guns ordered it to stop, seized it, and took its passengers prisoner. It was an act of war, plain and simple, and there was no walking it back. Then López sent his soldiers north into the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso, a vast, remote frontier, and overran it, capturing forts and towns almost before the empire in far-off Rio de Janeiro even understood what was happening. For a moment, it looked like audacity might actually work, but then Solano López made the decision that doomed him: to strike at Brazil where it would hurt, and to reach his allies in Uruguay. His armies needed to march south, and the shortest road south ran straight through a corner of Argentina, a province called Corrientes. López asked Argentina for permission to cross. Argentina, trying to stay out of the whole affair, said no, and López crossed anyway. He seized Argentine ships in the harbor of Corrientes. He marched his men onto Argentine soil, and in a single stroke he turned a neutral neighbor into a mortal enemy. Think about what he had done. He had picked a fight with Brazil, the largest country on the continent, and now he had handed Argentina every reason it needed to join in. The little coiled country was now at war with almost everyone around it all at once. In May of 1865, in the city of Buenos Aires, the three of them signed it: Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. And this is the document I want you to remember, because it tells you what kind of war this was going to be. It was meant to be secret. Its terms only became public later, when a copy was leaked and printed in the newspapers of Britain, and it caused a scandal when the world read it because of how far it went. The Allies agreed that they would not lay down their arms, would not make a separate peace, would not stop, until the government of Solano López was completely destroyed, not defeated, not pushed back to its borders, destroyed. They divided up on paper the territory they intended to take from Paraguay when it was over. It was, in a sense, a promise to fight to the end. And they would keep it, though not one of them, signing in that comfortable room in Buenos Aires, had the faintest idea what the end was going to cost. They imagined a short, sharp campaign. A few months, teach the upstart a lesson, collect the territory, go home. Almost everyone on every side believed the war would be over by Christmas. It would last more than 5 years. Brazil was not ready for it. The empire had a small professional army and a vast, comfortable confidence, and neither was equal to the task. It had to raise an army almost from scratch, calling up the volunteers of the fatherland. Though as the years ground on and the volunteers ran out, the state reached deeper and less gently for bodies to fill the ranks. It called up enslaved men, promising them freedom in exchange for the risk of death, a bargain we will come back to at the end, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The war everyone thought would be a quick lesson became the great labor of a generation. The first great turning point came not on land, but on the water, and it decided everything that followed. In this part of the world in that century, the rivers were the roads. If you controlled the great river, you controlled who could move, who could be supplied, who could be strangled. Paraguay, landlocked, lived or died by that river. And so in June of 1865, near a bend called Riachuelo, the Paraguayan fleet tried to smash the Brazilian navy in one bold surprise stroke and win the river for good. It failed. The Brazilian squadron, after a long and desperate day of iron and smoke and ships grinding into one another, destroyed the Paraguayan fleet almost entirely. And with that single day, the door slammed shut. Paraguay could no longer break out. It could no longer be freely supplied from the outside world. The war that Solano López had launched to make his country a great power had, within a year, sealed his country inside itself, to be squeezed slowly from every side for years. From that day, Paraguay was not fighting to win. It was fighting not to die. And it would not stop. What came next is the part that is hard to describe, because there is so much of it, and it is all so heavy. The war settled into the swamps and marshes along the river, a country of mud and reeds and fever, where the mosquitoes killed as many men as the muskets did. Cholera swept through the camps on both sides and emptied whole regiments without a shot being fired. I want you to picture just one of those soldiers, because the numbers are so large they stop meaning anything. Picture a Brazilian farm boy, 17 years old, who had never in his life been more than a day's walk from his village. Now 1,000 miles from home in a flat, flooded country of reeds and black water, where the sun cooked him by day and the fever shook him by night, waiting in a trench for the order to walk toward the guns. He could not have found Paraguay on a map before he was sent to conquer it. And picture the boy in the trench opposite, a Paraguayan, just as young, just as far from anything he understood, told that these invaders had come to wipe his country off the earth, and in his case very nearly right. Both of them were fed into the same swamp for years. That is what the small word war is hiding every time I say it. There was a battle called Tayuti in 1866, and I want to name it because it was, quite simply, the largest pitched battle ever fought on South American soil. Tens of thousands of men, hurled at one another in a single terrible day. The Paraguayans attacked the Allied lines with a courage that stunned their enemies, and they were cut down in numbers that are hard to even say aloud. And then, a few months later, came Curupati, and here the story turns, for a moment, against my own side. The Allies, confident, marched against a Paraguayan defensive line they had not properly scouted, trenches and cannon dug in behind a marsh. They walked into it. It was a slaughter. Thousands of Brazilian and Argentine soldiers fell in a few hours against those trenches, and the survivors reeled back in horror. It was one of the worst defeats the Allies suffered in the entire war, and it taught them a bitter lesson, that this small country was going to make them pay for every single yard. In Brazil, the defeat at Curupati landed like a blow to the face. There was grief and anger and a hardening. The young emperor, Dom Pedro, made it a matter of national honor that the war would be finished properly, whatever it took, however long it ran. It is easy, from a comfortable chair, to call that resolve. It is also the machinery by which a short war becomes a long one, and a long one becomes a catastrophe. Behind those trenches stood the thing the Paraguayans had built their hopes on, the Fortress of Humaitá. They called it the Gibraltar of the South, a great complex of guns and earthworks commanding the river, ringed by swamp that everyone said could not be taken. For 2 years it held. The Allies could not go around it easily and could not smash through it quickly, and so the war did what wars like this always do. It stopped being about clever moves and became about simple, grinding arithmetic. Who has more men? Who has more food? Who can bleed the longest? And in that arithmetic, a country of maybe 500,000 people could not, in the end, outlast an alliance of millions, and understand how long the longest really was. This was not a war of a few grand battles. It was more than 5 years of siege and stalemate and slow, costly advance up a single river, each fortress and each bend of the water paid for in men and in months. The newspapers back in Rio and Buenos Aires, which had cheered the war into being, grew quiet and then bitter. Fathers who had waved their sons off to a quick adventure waited, and many of them stopped waiting. A whole generation of young men on all 4 sides simply did not come home, and the ones who did came home older than their years, carrying the swamp in their lungs and the war in their eyes. Brazil sent its best soldier to finish it, Luís Alves de Lima e Silva, the Duke of Caxias, the man Brazilians still think of as the father of their army. He was patient and methodical, and slowly, expensively, he pried Paraguay open. Humaitá finally fell. The Paraguayan capital, Asuncion, was taken. By any ordinary logic of war, it was over. The government had lost its fortress, its fleet, its capital, most of its army. Any ordinary leader would have surrendered to save what was left of his people. But Solano López was not an ordinary leader, and this is where the story stops being a war and becomes something darker. He would not surrender. He would not even consider it. He gathered what was left of his army and his people, and marched them into the interior, into the wild country. And he kept the war going from the forest, retreating and retreating, dragging an entire nation behind him into the wilderness rather than admit that it was finished. And as the walls closed in, something broke in him. He became convinced that he was surrounded by traitors, that the reason he was losing was betrayal, conspiracy, plots against him. And so he began to destroy his own people. He ordered the arrest, the torture, and the execution of hundreds of his own officers, officials, and citizens on suspicion of disloyalty. He turned on the men closest to him. He turned, it is said, even on members of his own family. A country that was already being killed from the outside was now being killed from the inside by the very man leading its defense. It is one of the most chilling things in all of our history, a nation dying, and its ruler spending its last strength hunting for enemies within. Men who had fought loyally for years were denounced, dragged before hasty courts and shot on a suspicion, a rumor, a jealous word. And still the survivors followed him into the wilderness. That is the thing I could never fully explain to a classroom, that even as he turned on them, even as the cause became hopeless, thousands stayed and marched and died at his side. Was it loyalty? Was it terror? Faith? Some furious refusal to let their country's death count for nothing? Probably all of it tangled together the way it always is in human beings. By now, the men of Paraguay were mostly gone, dead in the swamps, dead at Tayuti, dead of cholera and hunger. So the army that López kept throwing at his enemies filled up with whoever was left, old men and boys, which brings us back to where we began. In August of 1869, at a place called Acosta Ñu, some call it the Battle of Campo Grande, an Allied force met a Paraguayan army of several thousand, and the survivors would say that a great many of them were children. Boys who should have been in a schoolroom, put into a line of battle, and the detail that has never left me, the one the survivors reported, is that some of those boys had been given false beards to wear, painted on or tied on, so that from across the field they might be mistaken for men. As if a country could disguise the fact that it had run out of everything but its children. To this day, Paraguay remembers that battle. It marks the date as a day for its children. Think about that. A nation that turned the worst day of its life into the day it honors the young. The accounts of that day are among the hardest in all of our history. Boys who fought with a ferocity that horrified the very soldiers cutting them down. A field that, when the guns fell silent, was covered with the small and the old. I will not dwell on it. I only ask you to hold it next to the picture we started with, the false beards, and to understand that this was not some rare, freak horror at the edge of the war. By the end, it was the war, a country being scraped down to its children and throwing them too into the fire, because one man would not say the word enough. The end came the following year in March of 1870 in a remote place in the north called Cerro Corá. There was almost nothing left, a ragged handful of followers, deep in the wilderness, still moving, still refusing. The Allied cavalry finally caught them, and there by a small river, Francisco Solano López was killed. The words tradition puts in his mouth at the end are these: I die with my country. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes those words land like a stone, is that it was very nearly true. He had not only died with his country, he had, to a degree almost without parallel in modern history, taken his country down with him. So let us talk gently about the cost, because this is the part that beggars belief. When the war ended, Paraguay was a ruin. Whole regions were empty. The fields were unworked. The towns were half-populated, and the men were simply mostly gone. Now I have to be honest with you, the way I always tried to be honest with my students, because history is not about pretending we know more than we do. Historians still argue fiercely about exactly how many Paraguayans died. The lowest serious estimates say the country lost perhaps a fifth of its people. The highest, and long the most repeated, say it lost more than half. Some say that of the adult men, as few as 1 in 10 survived. The truth is buried under lost records and a shattered census, and scholars may never fully agree. But sit with that for a moment. The argument is not over whether the loss was catastrophic. The argument is only over whether it was terrible or almost unimaginable. When even the low estimate of your dead is a fifth of everyone, you are looking at one of the worst demographic catastrophes any nation has ever suffered. Paraguay would take generations to recover, and in some ways the shape of that small country today still carries the wound. It lost great stretches of territory to Brazil and Argentina. It was occupied for years. Its brief, strange dream of being the counterweight of South America was over forever. Eliza Lynch, the woman who had risen at Solano López's side, buried him and their son with her own hands, the story goes, before she was driven out of the country, dying years later far away in Europe, largely forgotten, insisting to the end that she had loved a great man and a great cause. And Paraguay itself did not simply recover and move on. For a generation, it was a country of women, widows and daughters and mothers who rebuilt farms and villages and families in the near total absence of men. Travelers who passed through in the years after wrote of it with a kind of hush. A nation had been carried to the very edge of not existing and had to learn, slowly and painfully, how to be a nation again. That it is still there on the map today is its own quiet act of endurance. And now, my friend, comes the part they leave out of the schoolbook. Because you might think, well, at least Brazil won. Brazil was on the winning side. Brazil got its victory, its territory, its pride. And it did. But listen to what winning did to it. The war cost the Empire of Brazil a staggering fortune, debts it would carry for decades. And it did something quieter and far more dangerous. It sent home an army, a large, proud, battle-hardened army that had bled for years and now looked at the old imperial government with new eyes, and new confidence, and new demands. That army would never again be content to sit in the background. Within 20 years, it would be the officers who came out of this war and their students who overthrew the monarchy altogether. And there was something deeper still. To fill its ranks, Brazil had promised freedom to enslaved men who would go and fight. And so you had the spectacle of a country sending enslaved and freed black soldiers to die for an empire that still held hundreds of thousands of human beings in bondage back home. You cannot do that. You cannot ask a man to die for your flag while your flag denies he is a man, without the contradiction coming home with the survivors. The war poured fuel on the movement to end slavery in Brazil. Slavery would be abolished in 1888, and the monarchy that had won the Great War of the century would fall the very next year, in 1889, swept away by the Republic. Do you see it now? The Empire of Brazil marched into Paraguay to destroy Solano López, and it succeeded. It destroyed him utterly, but it came home carrying in its own baggage the seeds of its own ending, the empowered army, the debts, the unbearable contradiction of slavery held up to the light. The war that killed the Paraguayan nation quietly killed the Brazilian empire too. It just took 20 years to fall down. That is why I saved this one for last, all those years at the blackboard, because it is not a story with a hero and a villain and a tidy lesson. It is a story about the price of pride of one man's and of an empire's, and about how the winners and the losers of a great slaughter can both, in the end, be broken by it, in ways that take a generation to show. So let me leave you with the question I could never answer for my students, and I will not pretend to answer it for you. When Solano López stood in that wilderness with his country dying around him, and chose to fight on to the last child rather than surrender, was he the purest patriot his nation ever produced, a man who would not bow? Or was he a broken, vain man who mistook his own pride for his country's survival and dragged a whole people into the grave with him? I have gone back and forth on that my whole life. Tell me honestly where you land, patriot or madman, down in the comments, and tell me why. I read them. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for pulling up a chair. And the next time someone tells you they know the deadliest war ever fought in the Americas, you can tell them a Brazilian history teacher taught you the real answer, and that it happened in a place and a way that almost no one remembers. Until next time.